The Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians by E.A. Wallis Budge. This printing's older than I am, but still. But the text is from 1926, so. Chapter 7 is called The Wisdom of the Egyptians. The Greek writers tell us that their own sages and philosophers, Archimedes, Hecataeus, Plato, Pythagoras, Solon, Thales, went and studied in Egypt in order to become acquainted with the wisdom and learning of the Egyptians. But in what that wisdom and learning consisted, none of them has told us. Stephen the Martyr, in his dying speech, Acts 7:22, says that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and we shall perhaps be not far wrong if we assume that he thought Moses had read and studied the native Egyptian works on magic and religion, and had acquired a special knowledge of the Egyptian doctrines and beliefs concerning the origin of the world and of the entities and of men, and the resurrection and the world and life beyond the grave. We shall see later that the Egyptians did not possess the great and exact knowledge of mathematics, chemistry, and other sciences with which they have been credited, but it is impossible to think that the reputation for learning and wisdom and the knowledge of the mysteries was wholly undeserved. Well, actually, they're a lot better in those things than people initially assumed, but we've had an additional 100 years to look at some of this stuff. Well, I'll just say a century, not quite 100 years since this particular book, but to the Egyptians, mysteries. Shta meant the secret rites that were performed by specially initiated persons only, and also religious doctrines which seemed to be above or beyond ordinary human comprehension. Now, you can kind of, although it's difficult in some ways, you have got the plural, you got the determinative, it's stuff that can be recorded or passed on, it has a solid ground, it collects, or it goes out, and it has an oversight. So, the Egyptian priests and sages must be teachers of theoretical and practical magic, must have possessed some knowledge that was not to be found out of Egypt, and if they did, it concerned spiritual matters rather than material. The texts make it quite clear that the Kherhab priest and learned in Egypt studied matters that are now called occult. Well, isn't all religion occult? And that some of them possessed psychological powers of a remarkable character. Again, isn't religion supposed to refer to one's psychology, to involve one's psychology? There must always have been in Egypt a limited class of thinkers who tried to probe mysteries and wanted to know. Rux. And so Gnostic would be a Rux, Ruxnature, and to whom knowledge was its own reward. They probably wrote books on the subjects that they studied, but if they did, none of them has come down to us. For the ordinary Egyptian, the road to success and prosperity could only be traversed by knowing how to read and write. Hence, the extraordinary respect which was paid to the profession of the scribe and of the scribe himself. The unlettered man, Xm, was regarded everywhere as a fool and of no account. The principal branches of Egyptian learning were, but see, you got that double-handed thing going on. I don't, this doesn't have, much good connotation that in modern culture that we would see, but, mathematics. The Egyptians were not naturally great mathematicians. They owed their knowledge of the higher branches of the subject to the Greeks. They used the decimal system, but traces of a duodecimal system are found in the 12 hours, the 12 months, perhaps in the 12 signs of the zodiac, and in the 36 12 by 3 decans. The numbers 1 through 9 are represented by strokes, represented by, just, well, by the arch, you have 100. By the twist, by the arch, you have 10. 100 by the twist. 1,000 by this Mario-looking, lotus. But 100,000, 10,000 by the finger, and 100,000 by the frog with, a million by some bearded dude kneeling and going, he's got a little pokey hairdo, but, and there are signs for 10 million and 100 million. Thus, 1,765,949 is expressed by, like that, and 10 million years by 3 sets of the circle line. Kind of think like a Sioux or something, but addition and subtraction were often used. Now, actually, they use sort of a binary math, if you think there's some evidence of that, but multiplication and division were difficult. That's where it got simpler for them. And the multiplication table was unknown. Ordinal numbers were formed by the additions of nu to that number. Example, ding, ding, ding would have the pot that may have the pronunciation new in other contexts, but that would be the fifth. Fractions are expressed by the addition of what could be commonly shown with R, but if it's right next to a bunch of numbers, you got meaning apart. Thus, that in 4 lines would be a fourth. And the mouth and the hang down would be 2/3. But many fractions, like 5/8, were expressed in a clumsy fashion. Geometry and measures of length. The royal cubit, sutna, 524 meters, and the little cubit, hour, 450 meters, were used. Other measures were the finger breadth, the hand breadth, the palm, the span, and the length of the upper arm. In land measure, there was the arura, with its divisions of half, a fourth, an eighth, a 16th, and a 32nd. So, saute. The chief liquid measure was the hannu. And the 2 principal weights were the tban, 9.09591 grams, and the qat, 90.9591 grams. Astronomy, until the Egyptians came under the influence of Asiatic nations, and the Greeks and their notions of astronomy were very limited, and their stargazers were unable to define the length of the year correctly. The oldest known year to them contained 12 months divided into 3 seasons. Akat, Shatra, Pert, Bratra, and Shemut. Shnutra, each containing 30 days. To these they added a later period of the 5 epagomenal days, and the year then contained 365 days, and it was nearly a quarter of a day shorter than the solar year. It was not until the reign of Ptolemy III that any general attempt was made to reform the calendar, but a year of 365 days with an intercalculated day every fourth year was not adopted by the Egyptians until nearly 2 centuries later. Not to apply in some other reasons for they had better astronomy than that, but that's for another issue. This is just very limited information, an overview sort of book. The modern Egyptians began to sow their winter crops sometime in October, generally towards the end of the month, and these are all reaped by the middle of February, when they begin to sow their summer crops. At this time, the Falahin take up their abode. I don't remember the Arabic. Take up their abode in the fields, and they stay there until the summer crops are grown and reaped, say about the middle of June. In this month, the swelling of the Nile begins, and the waters from the great equatorial lakes make their appearance in Egypt. The final rise of the Nile takes place in October, and it seems that the period of the middle of June to the middle of October represents the old season of the inundation called Shnutra. If this be so, Shatra, the season of growing, began in October and ended in February, and Paratra, the season of coming out, began in February and ended in June. The natural agricultural year began at the end of the period of the inundation, which probably varied slightly in length. The Egyptologists think that Akat began on July 19th and ended November 15th. That Pert began on November 16th and ended on March 15th. That Shemut began on March 16th and ended on July 13th. And that followed the 5 epagomenal days. There is no proof that the Egyptians ever used the Sothic period or the Phoenix period. They had no era like that of the later Christians and the Muslims, and at first only dated their years by events. Later, they used the regnal years of their kings. Each month was dedicated to an entity, and every hour of the day, 12 hours, and every hour of the night, 12 hours, had its entity. Now, it's also can be said that the ancient Egyptians had something very interesting in terms of something like 80,000 years in one tradition of oral tradition. So it's not like they completely lost track of time. It's just they didn't have, like the Yazidi are about to arrive in year 6770, I think. The early Egyptians divided the stars into groups, in which they thought they saw the forms of men and beasts, and parts of beasts and other objects, and they seemed to have thought that these ruled the destinies of men. It is probable the star cult is the oldest in Egypt. Well, there's older remnants in Europe and to some degree, but the 5 planets known to them were Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and Venus. There is evidence that perhaps the first worship other than God was the stars, and questionable traditions in both the Jewish and the Islamic side have pointed to that. Questionable as in they're not 100%, but they could be. But anyways, 5 planets known to them: Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and Venus. The 36 decans were known to the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, but the signs of the zodiac were introduced into Egypt by the Greeks, who borrowed them from the Babylonians, who in turn had borrowed them from the Sumerians. The text mentions 2 sets of stars, the stars that never rest and the stars that never set. The last are probably the circumpolar stars. There is no proof that the Egyptians systematically observed the stars over a period of many thousands of years like the Babylonians, and the material at present available suggests that their knowledge of astronomy was very limited. Astrology, well, saying stuff with the stars, there's different, it's not all soothsaying and whatnot, and even if you're using symbolism, it isn't like you're saying, I know the unseen because I have seen some patterns in the physical. It's not quite like that. But anyways, such knowledge of the stars as was possessed by the Egyptians, they devoted to building up the science of astrology, which existed in Egypt from the earliest times, and pure astronomy, they were not interested, for they regarded the stars as merely as arbiters of their destinies and as things that express the will of the Creator. Well, that's overstating it too, but nothing was excluded from their mythology, let's say that. This view, being general in Egypt as well as Babylonia, the development of astronomy was impossible. Well, no. But we see they did have very precise astronomy in parts. But there's a variety of beliefs and practices and levels of technology and stuff, various cults and kingdoms and such, so let's not sameness claim them. The stars were considered gods, and from their appearances, color, movements, and positions, the astrologer made predictions and divinations concerning the outcome of events in Egypt generally, and the future actions of their kings, and the affairs of private individuals in every circumstance of life. As they ruled the heavens, so they ruled the earth and times and seasons. Every hour of the day and night throughout the year and every month had its regent, and according as the events which had happened to the entities at certain hours of the certain days of certain months were good or bad, parts of days and whole days were lucky or unlucky, and calendars of lucky and unlucky days and hours. The days are divided into 3 parts. Thus, the so-called lucky day is described like the fru by having 3, and an unlucky day like, is it aha and aha, aha? It doesn't sound as pleasant, right? And when a part of a day is lucky and the other 2 parts are unlucky, we have, 1 defer, 2 aha, and r, the defer in between the ahau, are the ahau before the defer sign, and so on. Because I don't know, like a drawing rack. What is that thing? It's like that. You got a pole, you have ding, 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 ding. What is that? I don't quite remember at the point. There were many kinds of astrologers, diviners, interpreters of dreams, casters of nativities, etc. But the aim of all these was the same, i.e. to direct or modify or annul the wills and operation of the star entities. The horoscope and astrolabe were not known to the Egyptians when they weren't called Egyptians, as some have supposed, for the former was invented by the Greeks and the latter by the Persians. It seems that the Egyptian astrologer drew up tablets of the positions of the planets and used them for foretelling events in the lives of men.